This episode profiles the life and death of one-time Mexican Mafia member Conrad "Big D" Garcia. On June 9, 2012, Conrad "Big D" Garcia passed away quietly at his San Fernando Valley home in Silmar, California, in the company of his family and loved ones. His legacy touched two predominant realms: the world of darkness and the circle of the redeemed. In each of these communities, he was widely known as Big D from San Fernando. Many of us in the Mexican Mafia prison gang referred to him as Dono, which was Spanish slang for his middle name Donald or Big D. Conrad Donald Garcia was born on January 22, 1941 in San Fernando, a suburb of Los Angeles, and was raised in the Valley, the northern region of LA, also known as El Valle de San Fernando. On March 7, 1943, Conrad Garcia was only 2 years old when his father was killed at a dance hall, shot to death at point-blank range by two party crashers. With this tragic event serving as a backdrop, violence would become his constant companion for many years. Big D was also state-raised by the California Juvenile, Youth, and Adult Penal System, where he made friends and some enemies in virtually every youth authority facility in the state of California. He was also a resident of several state prisons, where he established a violent reputation both inside the boxing ring and on the big yards of Folsom and San Quentin state prisons. Big D, as he preferred to be addressed, was one of the first wave of Mexican Mafia members. Not only did he rub shoulders with Güero Buff, the MF founder, in the late 1950s in the California Youth Authority, he was one of the main members of the restructured Mexican Mafia that included OGs like Kilroy from White Fence, Cheyenne Cadena, and Richie Reese from Bakersfield, Little Sluggo from Eloyo Maravilla, Güero Buff, and many other fellow members who were reunited as adult convicts inside San Quentin and Folsom prisons. While doing time at DVI in Tracy, a California youth facility known as the Gladiator School, one of Big D's closest friends and boxing partner was Gabriel Little Sluggo Castañeda from Eloyo Maravilla, a street legend from East LA. Although everyone wanted Sluggo and Big D to shake it up in the ring, they never fought each other, and Big D went undefeated during his years at DVI. He was released in the early 60s and married his first wife, who later died from overdosing on pills. Loaded on heroin, as he and an accomplice drove up to the San Isidro Customs booth, Big D was arrested entering the U.S. from Tijuana with heroin in the trunk of his car. He was subsequently sentenced to 8 years in a federal facility in Fort Worth, Texas, where he became a boxing legend. As a middleweight, he locked horns twice with a resident boxing champion known as Cleet Owens. Mexican boxers usually dominated the weight classes of welterweight and lower, whereas blacks and a few whites were predominantly the rulers of the heavier divisions. But Big D was somewhat special. At 155 pounds and 5'10", he packed pure power in both hands, could take a punch, and was very good on his feet. In their first fight, Cleet Owens was awarded a split decision, which nearly kicked off a riot as Mexican inmates protested loudly in what they felt was a robbery. In the rematch, Big D would not allow his opponent to go down in order to punish him, and the fight was one-sided. He destroyed Cleet Owens with a fifth-round TKO. Big D was a player on the streets, a ladies' man, and also established a violent reputation inside and outside the prison system. Big D had many nicknames. Many of us also referred to him as Romantic D or El Romantico, because he always seemed to have fine tenderloins wrapped around his arm. He was indeed a player. That is, until he met Linda, who would become the love of his life. But his love affair with heroin and the streets were still his first love, and Big D was arrested for murder, and his long-term destination was Folsom Prison. A dedicated sports fanatic and very athletic, Big D continued to box and play with the best handball players at Folsom Prison. He was involved in 2 homicides while at Folsom with his Mexican Mafia carnales, but avoided prosecution for both stabbings. Big D spent some time in the 4A Adjustment Center, but he was very charismatic and the prison guards liked him, as did the general convict population. Like most Mexican Mafia members, he interacted very well with inmates of all ethnic groups. When it was time to go to war, the gloves would come off, and we looked at life on the inside as business. Surviving was already second nature and a built-in mechanism. The word that was so appropriate for men like Big D and company was predator. We never saw ourselves being on the defensive, even when we were outnumbered. A predator is always on the offensive, and while I know that may sound arrogant and conceited, I suppose it was that attitude that kept us alive in the concrete jungle, being constantly on the offensive. There was a swagger, arrogance, and supreme confidence in the manner in which we carried ourselves. Those who knew Big D, not just his M. Carnales, also knew he was a straight shooter and had a good heart. As proficient as Big D was with a knife and with his fists, there were other Mexican Mafia members who were just as skilled at Folsom, both in the ring and dancing on the asphalt on the prison yards. There was Armando Mandy Varela from First and Indiana, Ernest Kilroy Royball from White Fence, Roy Sonny B. Ballesteros from Big Hazard, and Richard Richie Reese from Bakersfield. These were some of the more highly active and aggressive MM members residing at El Cantón de Drácula, the House of Dracula, as Folsom was affectionately called by the Mexican inmates. While on the streets and very actively conducting Mexican Mafia business, I was traveling to Northern California, driving north on Interstate 5, and just before getting onto the Grapevine, I made a pit stop in Saugus to have lunch with Big D. At night, he was supervising drug operations and other criminal enterprise in the San Fernando Valley. During the weekdays, he kept his parole officer happy by working as a janitor at the College of the Canyons in Santa Clarita. Although as a general practice, it was never encouraged to discuss the hits we committed with anyone, including fellow carnales. Some of us were in the loop, as they say, and we would share certain intel with each other. Some of the fellows like Elfie Sosa and Rocky Luna from Hazard simply enjoyed bragging about their exploits and giving us all the details, whereas others would have motives such as extolling the performance of a fellow brother who had done a good job. Big D normally kept things close to the vest, but on this particular day, he discussed the murder of Richard Rodriguez, also known as Güero Psycho from San Fernando. Güero Psycho was a Mexican Mafia member and a fellow homeboy of Big D's, who had screwed up with the fellas by stealing money. On December 3rd, 1977, Big D and Vito Rodriguez, the younger blood brother of Güero Psycho, paid a visit to the Silmar home of their target. According to Big D, they knocked on the front door, and Güero Psycho, who was asleep, recognized his brother and fellow MM member and opened the front door. Vito then, without batting an eye, opened fire, killing his older brother. According to Big D, he was very proud of his fellow homeboy, who I understand was later inducted into the M. To my personal knowledge, it was the first time a Mexican Mafia member was killed by his own blood brother. In this particular case, it not only served as the ultimate demonstration of loyalty to La M, but also guaranteed his membership by his padrino, his sponsor, Big D. What a way to make your bones. Sometime in the mid to late 1980s, I was already away from the Mexican Mafia when I was made aware that Big D and a few other Mexican Mafia guys had received the Lord and were now serving a new master in life. Never surprised at what God can do in someone's life, I was very happy for Big D, Kilroy, Conejo, Johnny Green Eyes, and others who turned their back on that life. In the early 1990s, the Mexican Mafia embarked on a street project that would forever transform the manner in which Mexican-American gang members in Los Angeles and Southern California conduct street business. In Orange County, Mexican Mafia member Pete Sana Ojeda put the word out that street gang feuds would come to a halt. Big D was invited to attend and address a group of gang members. Surely this was Sana's way of exploiting Big D's sincere message of peace to serve Sana's purpose of controlling and influencing young gang members who were always impressed with the presence of a big homie. Big D talked about his relationship with the Lord, shared his Christian message, and blessed them as he departed. Some of those same gang members later shared with Big D how his message on that day contributed to them turning their lives around. When messengers of darkness and agents of the Lord meet, there is a strange phenomena that takes place. What man intends for harm and evil, God often plays a role in releasing his power in those encounters and turning evil into good. Like myself at one period of time, Kilroy, Big D, Conejo, and Johnny Green Eyes, to name some, were all on that same course to hell with seemingly no hope. I had the opportunity to read Big D's book entitled Big D, Victorious Through God's Grace by D Garcia. I am thrilled to know they saved their souls. When I see these guys in the next life, in heaven's version of LA County Jail 1750 gang module, God will not have me in protective status or on keep-away status. I will be happy to reunite with these saints who turned their back on Satan. Mucho respeto a Big D. Much respect to Big D. I know he and the Lord are enjoying each other's company.